Perhaps someday it will not be necessary to have Black History Month. After all, the people of color are first and foremost Canadians, and Canada Day is July 1st. But until that day, here is my offering, a few questions and more than a bit of family history. I would like to start with a question most white people are rarely asked, especially if they do not have an accent. A question they are not asked even if their last name is Blaschuk, DeVries, Peterson, Luongo, Chernovsky, because they are white. They are not asked, "Where are you from?" By asking that, you are telling someone that they are not from here, they're from somewhere else. You are not one of us. Just as Rosemary Brown, I hope you remember her, was deemed to be when she was rebuked on the floor of the BC legislature some decades ago with, "Go back to where you came from." These words hurled by Social Credit member Pat Jordan as Rosemary was delivering a paper on childcare. After nearly a quarter of a century of citizenship here, Rosemary was still not deemed Canadian, but from somewhere else she needed to go back to. And I was asked just a week ago over at the City Square Mall, "Where are you from?" I knew the questioner could see only one feature about me and nothing else. I recall not long ago watching with painful embarrassment as an elderly acquaintance in Nanaimo asked a young Ahousaht man whose family goes back maybe 30,000 years on the land. She asked him, "Where are you from?" She assumed he was not Canadian. Why? Because he was brown. I remember asking my grade 6 class, of about 40% of whom were from the Musqueam Reservation. I said, "Who is the real Canadian? Mrs. Wilkinson, the school secretary, who happened to be a recent immigrant and white, or Bill Michelle, their fellow classmate?" It was unanimous. They all believed Mrs. Wilkinson, with her strong New Zealand accent, was the real Canadian, not the young man from Musqueam. Why? She was white, of course. Being white automatically makes you a Canadian. And even if your great-great-grandparents came from China to build the railway before Confederation, as is the case with my friend Fei Wong, you're not a Canadian, you're Chinese. Even though my grandfather was enlisted to fight for Canada in World War I more than 100 years ago and represented this country at the Stockholm Olympics more than 100 years ago, why am I still being asked, "Where are you from?" My question is, why is that question still being asked with unrelenting frequency? And I would like to offer you a bit of our Canadian history that gave birth to this notion of white Canada. And I will start with another question. Why is it that 50,000 Black people lived in this country prior to Confederation? And yet, by 1954, the Black population in Canada stood at 15,000, despite decades of government campaigning to bring immigrants to this country. Over the decades, millions of whites were welcomed to our shores, Europeans from every country, even the Doukhobors, who were abhorred for their beliefs and thrown out of Russia. The fact is that Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and South Africa were British colonies and intended as new white homelands for the overcrowded British Isles. The Indigenous peoples in these far-flung lands were moved off their homes, their communities, their nations, and set aside with virtually no rights at all. And only white immigration was allowed. For almost 100 years, successive Canadian governments kept the immigration of Blacks to 100 per year. And the majority of these were men, and they were all channeled into portering. It did not matter their country of origin. Our Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, considered himself a close friend of the American President Woodrow Wilson. Before he was elected, Wilson had campaigned on the commitment to allot more civil service jobs in the U.S. to blacks. Yet on his election, he fired every single one of them except for the few who worked in post offices. And those few who remained as postal employees were required to work behind a screen. Laurier and Wilson are said to have frequently commiserated over the problems of the darker race. Laurier despaired that any increase in our black population beyond the few already here, some of whom were descendants of slavery in this country, some having escaped slavery in the United States, and some who were brought to Nova Scotia as a reward for having fought on the side of the British in the U.S. War of Independence. Laurier would often use the N-word in our federal parliament when referring to members of the black population. And he succeeded in 1909 in having passed into Canadian law that black immigration would be limited to 100 per year. And the employment of these would be in the railways. The Canadian black population, except for a very few who had found other employment prior to 1909, lived along the railway corridors of the Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Railways. They lived in Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver. And so you can imagine how marginalized and limited black life was here in this great country. For several reasons, these families lived close to the railway stations. One, when calls came for replacement porters, it was important that you were close by so you could get there and get the job before someone else did. Two, it was hardly a living wage, and so these men did not want to waste their money traveling by bus or other paid transportation. And thirdly, land around the train stations was not expensive. Homes squeezed into where these train stations were not lavish. Rooming houses sprung up to provide accommodation for porters on layovers, usually for 24 to 36 hours, before they headed back on their next 8-day trip to the other side of the continent. Back on the rails, these men would work through the night, putting off passengers at small station stops across the country, shining the shoes for all passengers. The end of World War II saw many more immigrants from Europe arriving in our cities. There was a lot of discussion in the media about the newcomers and their roles, and the roles they would play in this country. But in 1945, the Winnipeg Free Press, publishing in a city that was the heart of the railway system, published an editorial, quote, "Speaking of immigration, as so many of us do these days, when is some member of Parliament going to take up the case of the porters? These men have been subjected to many years of the most unfair type of discrimination, just because they happen to be Negroes. Porters were being ill-served by their own union, whose head represented all the other jobs in the railway, and they made no demands on behalf of the porters, not wages, not hours, nor working conditions. Parliamentarians were not about to do anything about it. They were satisfied with the status quo, and you can be sure that they were all white." In 1948, the United Nations unveiled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The renowned Canadian law professor John Humphreys, along with Eleanor Roosevelt, drafted this absolutely remarkable document. Great Britain signed on in 1948 and pledged the promotion of the dignity of human personage, the right to free choice for work, the right to participate in the culture, the right to have a nationality, regardless of race, color, sex, language, social origin, etc. There are 30 rights included in that document. Great Britain brought a lot of pressure to bear on the Canadian government to sign on to this document, but to no avail. Despite the fact that this document was drafted for the UN by a Canadian, our government would not sign. The racialized part of the UN Declaration were finally accepted by Canada in 1960 when we drew up our own document, the Canadian Bill of Rights, under Conservative Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. Although those rights were enshrined in Canadian law in 1960, it took many years or decades before they became part of employment practice. And dare I say, we have never been able to achieve many of the intended goals. I now offer you a look at our families and the on-the-ground experiences of living in this white country and ending up here in this white city. On my father's side, I know almost nothing. As the case was for many people of color in this country, no records were made of births and deaths. And for a long time, I thought this was probably a mistake or it was a rarity, until I spoke with well-known Canadian author Paul Yee, who told me that in the 50s, he and his brother were born in small-town Saskatchewan, and both their parents died before they reached the age of 5. And when an aunt came to collect the boys and take them to Vancouver, there were no records at the hospital, in the city files, or in the provincial statistics. So there were no birth certificates to bring back to the coast because they were not Canadian. They were Chinese. They were not recorded. So although my father spent the last 25 years of his life searching for a birth record in Nova Scotia and a few US cities, it seemed he came out of nowhere, except his parents were Margaret and Harry, and they were black. So I shall begin really with my mother's father, John Armstrong Howard. He was born in 1888. His father operated the barber shop at the Winnipeg Grain Exchange. And at 6'2" tall, Army, as he was called, was a superb athlete. He excelled at baseball and boxing, and he also excelled at running. In the years leading up to the 1912 Olympics, he had defeated the top American sprinters who came up to Winnipeg to run in the famed Eaton's meet and other competitions. I have read many newspaper accounts of this 22-year-old man, Canada's champion, who went on to represent Canada in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm. In all those accounts, he was referred to as a horse, a darky, a dusky boy. Not one of them used the word man. When the team mustered in Montreal before sailing to the host games, hosted in Stockholm, Army was not allowed to stay at the team's hotel. Private accommodation in the home of a black family nearby was found for him. It was hard for me to read the newspaper accounts of its treatment on board the ship. He was constantly mocked and ridiculed by Coach Knox, who headed the Canadian delegation. On his arrival in Stockholm, his amateur status was challenged because one of the prizes he'd been given at a particular meet was thought to have been cash. His eligibility to run was not announced until just hours before his first heat. And although he had defeated Craig, Lippincott, and Meyer, the 3 finalists, the Americans, Army did not make the final. He won his first heat handily, and then he became ill with stomach flu or some kind of stomach ailment. And as my brother would experience in the post-1960 Olympics, Army came home an embarrassing disappointment to the Canadian people. Army worked as a railway porter out of Winnipeg and did manage to run in many competitions across this country for a number of years after the Olympics. And I have been able to garner some other additional bits of information to tell you of this man whom I never met and who was never, ever spoken about in my childhood home. Historian Stephen Hume wrote a great piece in the Vancouver Sun about my grandfather's Olympic medal, competitor's medal, coming back to the family. In 2010, I had just run the Olympic torch in a relay of Olympic old-timers from 56 and 60. And Yvonne Zacharias asked me in her news coverage of the torch run if I had been running for Harry as well, and I gave an eager yes, but added, but for my grandfather too, John Armstrong Howard. A few days later, a school principal in Delta, who had read that article, phoned me with the story of my grandfather and my grandfather having been his best friend. and the story unfolded of baseball teammates, of a best man who was kept from entering the church for the wedding of the other because of his color, and of how Army's medal ended up in the MacDonald family for 3 generations, and finally came to me during Vancouver's Olympic year. When World War I started, black men in Canada were not eligible to enlist, but as the war dragged on, more bodies had to be found. And so, in April of that year, Army enlisted and was shipped to Europe. I know much of this now because 2 years ago, the Canadian Armed Forces did a special presentation featuring him as Canada's first black Olympian, and even provided photos of him competing in track meets in Paris in 1919. My grandfather had time to train and compete there after the war's end because the Canadian government was slow to demob its black soldiers. They had not really wanted to bring them home. Army arrived back in Winnipeg in late 1919, followed some months later by his girlfriend, Edith Lipscomb, with their small infant daughter, who had been born in London, April 30th, 1920. My mother, Elsie Ellen Howard, was made legitimate when the couple married in Winnipeg that year. To most people in Canada, there could not have been anything more abhorrent than a mixed-race couple. Although Army managed to get some work on the trains, it was impossible to find housing. So they loaded up their buckboard with their few possessions, and this family tried its luck at the town of St. Rose du Lac. My grandmother had no idea that they would be stoned from the town as she sat next to Army, clinging to their infant daughter. Edith had never imagined what a vile image they represented. They continued north and eventually squatted on land near the Crane River Indian Reservation. And while Army would go back and forth to Winnipeg to work as a porter, Edith, who had come from a market gardening family, farmed and also learned from the First Nations how to trap and skin animals to sell to the furriers who came through the region. Army and Edith had 3 girls. But when the 4th one was born, he could see that this was not his child. The long and frequent absences to work on the railway had meant the marriage was clearly faltering. Edith eventually married to a white man in the town of Dauphin, keeping her youngest white daughter, Caroline, but turning out Elsie at age 13 to work as a domestic in the home of a judge, Connie, aged 11, to a reform school, and Kay, aged 9, who was taken into the care of her grade 4 teacher. Edith was now free to live white, free of the scourge that blackness had brought to her life. Army Howard died in 1938 in Winnipeg. His close friend and fellow porter, Harry Vincent Jerome, my dad, made a trip up to Dauphin to see how the daughters of his friends were doing. It was in 1940 that Elsie and he married, and their son, Harry Winston Jerome, my older brother, was born September 30th in a small town on his railway run, Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, at Holy Family Hospital. The family settled in Winnipeg, where I, my older sister Carolyn, and my younger brother Barton were born. Unlike many other porters' families, my father was very keen that we not live near the train station. We settled where his income could afford, in the French community of St. Boniface. I remember well the raids on our home by the CNR police. Because my dad was very involved in trying to get better conditions for porters and was agitating for the porters to get their own union, he was a problem for the company. And a likely way to be able to fire him was to find in his home goods brought into Canada illegally from the United States. My dad's run at that time was from Winnipeg to Duluth, Minnesota, a shorter run than the transcontinental out to the West Coast. This allowed him to be home more. But no illegal items were ever found, and finally my dad and his fellow activist, Carson Walker, were transferred to the far distant outpost of Vancouver, where there was no hotbed of labor strife. It was midsummer of 1951 when we arrived in Vancouver and took up residence for a week at the Stratford Hotel on Cordova Street, the only hotel in Vancouver that would take Black people. We then moved to a boarding house on 6th Avenue, just west of Main Street. Mrs. Taylor ran a busy establishment with an all-Black clientele, and it was here that we met our family's great friend, Mary Beaver. Other than our dad's elderly friend, Ike Bradford, who we would see maybe only every 6 months or so because he worked as a cook on freighters that traveled the oceans of the world, Mary worked as a domestic, and she was the first and only Black friend we had as a constant in our lives. Toward the end of that short stay on 6th Avenue, I remember very vividly going to the P&E. Our father and mother dragged us around for an entire day, into the evening, through animal barns reeking of manure and past the colorful games and inducements to come and try our luck. The smells of the cotton candy, the French fries, and the hamburgers were absolutely intoxicating and never again seemed so magical and exciting as it did that very warm August evening, 1951. And at the month's end, we moved to a new home at 416 Lyon Place in North Vancouver. Again, not wanting us to live in close proximity to the train station in that area now referred to as the downtown east side, our dad chose the working class community of Lower Lonsdale, where many immigrants had employment at the Burrard Dry Docks. For that first week before school started, we could sense that people were not at all friendly. But we took ourselves out the back door and onto the school grounds to stretch our legs and meet two of the neighborhood kids, Ken and Annabelle Mackenzie. They were free to play outside all day as their single-parent mum worked the night shift at North Van General Hospital as a nurse, and she slept all day. Muriel Mackenzie was the only homeowner on that street who did not sign a petition in an attempt to block our residency. Since many neighborhoods in Greater Vancouver had property deeds with covenants to prevent the sale of homes to Blacks, Asians, and Jews, why wouldn't the people on Lyons Place have the same expectations of living white, free of the darker race? Plural. This was perfectly legal, and it only became illegal in the late 1970s. And some property deeds in this city still carry these covenants, I believe. That first day of school, that Tuesday after Labor Day, was a nightmare. Although there had been a failed petition to prevent our moving into that all-white neighborhood, we had no idea that outright war would be pitched to keep us from the classrooms. Harry, Carolyn, and I, and our youngest sibling, Barton, who was to start grade 1 that day, had not yet set foot on the grounds when we had to turn and run back across 8th Street with stones, pebbles, and rocks stinging and thumping on our legs, our backs, and our heads. That is a memory I have never been able to lose. It was our father, when he returned from his railway run on that Friday, who took us across the street to demand our right to go to that school. We lived amongst hostile neighbors, the majority of whom never uttered a word to us from September of 51 until the summer of 1954. The 9 children of the Patterson family attacked us physically and verbally any time we were in the street. And in 1953, when a fire had broken out because our old sawdust burner had failed, we stood out in the street at 2 a.m., our mother pregnant with our younger sister Louise, and they never engaged us. Probably because I was the lightest skinned, I was sent to the home of our next door neighbor, Mrs. Mason. As the sirens blared, the window blinds on each house along the street rose. No one came out to offer us a bed or even a spot on the floor in their living room. We went by taxi to the Salvation Army Hall in Lonsdale and slept on chairs. The ongoing racist behavior and bullying we endured at Ridgeway Elementary made me reluctant to go to school until after I'd heard the bell rung. And in the old days, the teacher went out with the bell and rang it. After I'd heard the bell rung out on the grounds, I would sit at the breakfast table staring into a bowl of gray sludge, unable to choke down a mouthful until after the bell was rung. And this I would vomit into the girls' washroom on reaching the building. Well before the bell was heard, Harry would have already left to go out and play soccer and throw a football, or to play scrub baseball with a few friends. Our younger brother Barton, who had been suffering grand mal seizures for most of his life, attended Ridgeway for only half of the grade 1 year, in which he was frequently given the strap by big burly principal Mr. Terry Bowman. It was a brutal image. This frail little boy who would be lashed on each hand because, as he said, because I can't learn. A special class opened up in North Van at another school not far away, and Barton, with his little lunchbox, would walk down to Keith Road every morning and board the bus to Queen Mary School. Just before our younger sister Louise was born in the fall of 1953, Barton was jettisoned from our family to the infamous Woodland School in New Westminster. And that painfully sad story will not be part of this evening's presentation. In the summer of 1954, we moved up the hill to 17th and Sutherland to a new but very tiny bungalow. All but one family came to be on speaking terms with us. At Sutherland, we met our first Black North Vancouver family, the Pokes. The only other time our family saw Black children was at the annual Porter's Christmas party hosted by the CNR at the train station. And as we grew, and it was an all-Black affair, and as we grew up, we knew all the Black people we would ever encounter. They were either a Collins, a Ramsey, or a Crump, etc. Their fathers were porters. It was not until the early 60s, when a group of students from the Caribbean arrived at UBC, and the BC Lions had also hired a few Black players, that there were Black people who were not porter families. Throughout our years of schooling, the curriculum was excluding of anything not white. One exception, of course, was music, in which we were expected to join in singing Stephen Foster songs of happy darkies, longing for the plantation and the cotton fields. The illustrations accompanying the lyrics were cartoonish black orbs with bulging white eyes and fat lips, often depicted eating watermelon. These songbooks were government curriculum up to grade 9. And in social studies, the representation of any brown people were very primitive, almost naked Africans or indigenous peoples. It was during my early 20s that I remember Little Black Sambo finally being removed from the bookshelves of the school libraries. Amos and Andy and Jack Benny's Fool's Servant were the only Blacks to be seen in film or television until we finally had Harry Belafonte and Dorothy Dandridge to show us that we really could be talented and beautiful. But our skin and our hair were not part of the notion of beauty. There were no advertisements in any media that included non-white people. The remarkable Nat King Cole show was canceled within a few weeks of its launch because Coca-Cola withdrew its sponsorship after the people of the South had protested the presence of his presence on their TV screens. Besides the overwhelming inundation of all things white in the curriculum, we were reminded daily, in big and small ways, that we were not the same as other kids, and certainly not their equal. I remember that even people I liked did not necessarily see me as I might have hoped. I was crushed when I overheard my Girl Guide leader saying that I must have cheated on the test for the child care badge because I had achieved 100%. She had not even considered that I, as well as having studied hard, had a baby sister and knew from experience most of the answers. But certainly one of the most egregious examples of the inability of the white population to see us as who we were was the year Harry graduated from North Van High in 1959. That year he had pitched 2 no-hitter baseball games during the regional championships. He was a high-scoring member of the school football team, and he made Canadian newspaper headlines with his breaking of Percy Williams' sprint records. He brought North Vancouver High to his highest ever placing at the Inter-High Track Championships with his great relay legs and his individual wins. At the end of graduation year, the presentation of Outstanding Athlete went to the very handsome quarterback of the football team. Our experiences of over-racism were unending. We were surrounded by people who strongly believed with every fiber of their being that they were superior to us in every way. And beliefs about people of color were nurtured by the laws, the culture, and the education system. I once sat on a bus in Vancouver as two workmen sat at the front, not far from the driver, and in loud voices they called out, "Look at that nigger bitch. I bet she's a great lay." The people on that bus, after glancing back at me, looking slightly embarrassed, they just went on with their trip. No one challenged these men to stop. And the bus driver, who was sitting close enough to easily hear them, to hear what was said, did absolutely nothing. And I was way too frightened to get off the bus for fear of being followed. This was an excruciating humiliation, needless to say. But starting in the late spring of 1958, our lives began to change. And the change was dramatic, transforming. I went from working in the school cafeteria at lunchtime as a way of avoiding going home for lunch and also avoiding the unhappiness on the school grounds from grades 7 to 9, to being invited to join others for lunch, and by the end of grade 12, I was elected to Students' Council. In 1958, Harry and I were invited to join a new track club that was practicing at Vancouver Technical High School. We had each done track at our respective schools, Harry at North Van High, I at Sutherland. And importantly, Ben Burdette, Harry's baseball coach and summer employer, had convinced my brother that despite having pitched 2 no-hitters in championship games and having bunted and stolen bases with unimaginable speed, that he really needed to look to an individual sport. Having to endure the racist comments from the spectators and the opposing players was bad enough. But the racism coming from his own team members was intolerable. So Harry had taken up the challenge of a braggart in North Vancouver who had wondered if he could transfer the speed from the baseball pitch to a race on the track. Harry soundly thrashed his challenger. And then the gates to success swung widely open when Harry broke Percy Williams' 30-plus-year-old 102.20 records at Empire Stadium at our beloved Vancouver and District Inter-High School track meet. Then, the largest meet of its kind in North America. The Vancouver newspapers ran large photos of Harry with the reclusive Williams, who looked more than happy to congratulate him. After a year of training at Vancouver Tech High School track, where I was never able to climb the chain-link fence to the dressing rooms, our track club moved its practices to Brockton Oval in Stanley Park. This became for us a fabulous oasis of peace and calm, of a family with a loving coach. We were judged by the stopwatch and the tape measure, not the color of our skin. These practice sessions were as gratifying as the competitions we were preparing for, perhaps even more so. Laughter filled those magical evenings, which would sadly come to an end as the sky darkened. This was our real home. Even on rainy winter weekend mornings when we pounded through ankle-deep puddles on the cinder track, we were elevated and warmed from within by the camaraderie, the love, and the respect that kept us there regardless of the weather. Even the fact that there were no washrooms for the girls on Saturdays because the rugby teams took over both dressing rooms, missing a practice was never an option. And at the 1959 Canadian Track and Field Championships, Harry, aged 18, won the senior men's 100 and 200 meters and anchored BC's winning relay teams. And no one on earth was more astonished than I just a couple of months after my 15th birthday, when I won the women's 60, 100 long jump and placed third in the high jump. We were selected to represent Canada at the Pan American Games the following month. And as a reminder of how white this country was, our friend Paul, Harry, and I made up the sum total of black participants from across this wide country at those Canadian championships. Harry was positively a shining superstar, as I'm sure all of you know. After graduating from North Van High, he accepted a scholarship to the University of Oregon, where he completed both a bachelor's and master's degree of science. While competing under Coach Bill Bowerman, he won NCAA championships and AAU championships and set countless records for sprints, both indoors and outdoors. The white world of Eugene was very often a challenge to negotiate, but Harry's reputation often smoothed his path. However, when he saw that other black men coming into a restaurant were not being served, he would leave his meal and leave the restaurant. John Minichello was our Vancouver Optimist Striders coach. He was also our mentor and guide. He became a lifelong friend. Under John's tutelage, Harry set his first world record of 10 flat for the 100 meters. He tied the existing 100-yard record at 9.3, and then over several years, he lowered that record to 9.2, and then ultimately to 9.1. He set the 9.2 at Empire Stadium on August 25th, 1962, and made the front pages of our daily newspapers. And yet, for the next 3 weeks, he was unable to rent an apartment in Vancouver, where the rent signs would remain long after his meetings with the landlords. It was our friend Dr. Sheila Thompson who had to find and rent an apartment for him and his wife, Wendy. Harry competed in 3 Olympics for Canada, the first being Rome in 1960, where he had won both his heats, but in the semi-final ruptured his hamstring and did not finish. You cannot imagine the vilification of this 19-year-old on the streets and in the press. One instance well remembered by his friend Keith Wilson was that they were in a cafe shortly after we came home from Rome. Harry and Keith were sitting at a table when a rather elegant man stepped up to their table. They were eating at Scott's Cafe, which used to be an elegant establishment on Granville Street. Anyway, this man walked up to the table and he asked, "Are you Harry Jerome?" Harry eagerly smiled and said yes, and started to stand up, when this man shouted in the loudest possible voice, "You are the biggest bastard in this country." Harry was only 19. He'd pulled a hamstring. But anyway, for the 22 years after that Olympic tragedy, Harry was still deemed to be a quitter. In 1982, he had started the proceedings just before his death to sue Al Davidson of CKNW, who had often stated on the air that Harry was a gutless quitter. And Maclean's magazine published an obit for him in December of '82, stating that he ignominiously withdrew from his Olympic semi-final in 1960. However, Harry was no quitter. By the spring of '61, he was back training, and in '62, he ran the 100-yard world record, as I said, at Empire Stadium, and went off to the Commonwealth Games in Perth, Australia, where in the final, his left quadricep came completely off the knee, leaving a fist-sized indent in the front of his leg. The Vancouver Sun headlined Alan Fotheringham's article, "Jerome Quits Again." And despite the groundbreaking surgery by Vancouver surgeon Hector Gillespie, and weeks in the hospital and months in a cast, Harry was maligned loudly and booed in this country. Still, Harry did not dispense with his dream of an Olympic gold. In 1963, he spent the entire year swimming, which he'd never done before, and training in new ways in order to gain confidence in the repaired muscle. And in 1964, he led the Oregon Ducks to another NCAA championship. He headed off to the Tokyo Olympics with that left thigh still several inches smaller than his right, but the same zeal and determination. He placed third in that Olympic final and fourth in the 200 meters, the only sprinter to do the double in those games. It was by 3/100ths of a second that Enrique Figueroa from Cuba had edged him out for the silver, while Bob Hayes claimed the gold with a new Olympic record. In these pre-steroid days of track and field, sprinters retired after their college years were over. It was pretty well unheard of to find a man over 22 in the sprints. In 1965, and he was born in 1940, in 1965, the still determined Harry held his dream and competed in Europe that summer, and in 1966, he won the British Commonwealth Games gold. In 1967, the Pan American Games gold. And in 1968, considerably over his best sprinting weight, Harry was part of his third Olympics team for Canada when he placed 7th in the 100-meter final, won by Jim Hines, the American. Harry's days of competing were over, but Pierre Elliott Trudeau had attended those games in '68 and encouraged Harry to come to Ottawa to work. It was time to move on. Harry left an amazing legacy of achievements, having equaled and established almost a dozen world records for the 50 meters, 50 yards, 100 meters, and 4x100 relays. He competed in countless small towns and communities right across this country, never snubbing what some people referred to as bushmeats, because they were too small and not grandiose, I guess. And he competed as well, of course, in the great sporting arenas around the world. Always eager to spread the word, the passion, to some youngster who needed to find the kind of home that we had found at Brockton Oval. Now, moving to Ottawa, he hoped to bring opportunities to all Canadian young people. He was a man in a hurry, as if he knew his life would be like his races, short but intense. He led sports demonstrations teams as they toured hundreds of elementary schools and high schools from the Atlantic to the Pacific, featuring Canadian Olympians from gymnastics and track and field. His second big project in Ottawa, with greater depth and scope, was an initiative that would come into the homes of youngsters on Kellogg's cereal boxes. The enrollment for the workbooks and the awards were being sponsored by that company. Tens of thousands of pieces of promotional material, as well as a promotional team with costumes, were set to roll out after intense years of planning with the renowned artist Gary McCarty. And just days before the launch, the Member of Parliament, Grace McGuinness, rose in the House of Commons to say that no government should be working with private industry. After more than 2 years of careful research, planning, and having tested much of the materials at large and small country fairs and at random locations in the north and on First Nations reserves and at athletic clubs, the Grunion Project was killed on the floor of the House of Commons. Disgusted by this narrow stance and frustrated by the failure of his project to come to fruition, Harry lost some of the hope that had brought him to Ottawa. But he continued, and eventually health and welfare evolved into fitness and amateur sport. A lot of promotions were happening. He watched others moving up the ladder and assuming roles at better salaries for much less commitment to their mandate. After discussions with his long-experienced co-workers and friends, he eventually wrote a letter explaining his concerns to the upper echelon bureaucrats. And the response he received made it very clear to him that there was a glass ceiling for people of color in Canada's civil service. He left that department and went to work for Festival Canada, where he would have greater opportunities to work at the grassroots level and in communities. But ultimately, Harry moved back to BC and managed to ascertain funding for a 5-year project, the Premier Sports Award Program, that went into every school and community centre in the province. Much like his Grunion project, there were award incentives, coaching, and instructional manuals. And here, Harry worked in partnership with Canada's first 7-foot high jumper and Rhodes Scholar Wolf Wedman on this project. It was piloted in the elementary schools in Kitwangaa, where Harry personally traveled to promote it amongst the Indigenous population, and locally at schools like the one in which I was teaching in 1981. When he wasn't working around the clock on this initiative, he was coaching soccer teams or picking up the phone to call at advertisers about including a diversity of peoples in their promotions. He took on the Vancouver School Board as they advertised their night school programs with only white learners. Their response in future promotions was to put an abstract design rather than a diversity of faces on their brochures. A positive representation of peoples of color was hard to find. Books, theater, teachers, elected officials, and even in most sports. For at that time, even the Boston Celtics were slow to hire their first black player. Harry died December 7th of 1982, having been released from hospital to attend the funeral of Percy Williams. In the previous weeks, the Premier Sports Award program had been officially launched. He would have been happy to know that the Premier Sports Award program reached tens of thousands of British Columbian children who wore with pride the award badges, and that many teachers had been able to upgrade their teaching of physical education and sharpen their coaching skills with the instructional manuals he provided in 12 sports. Harry had so desperately wanted other young people to enjoy the bounty of good fortune and happiness that had been brought to him through sport. He had been awarded many honors. The most esteemed to him was the Order of Canada in 1972. And he had been inducted to BC and Canada Sports Hall of Fame and represented in the Walk of Fame in Toronto. And the University of Oregon renamed one of their facilities the Harry Jerome Weight Center. Prince Albert unveiled a cairn in 1985. And in 1988, we unveiled the beautiful statue in Stanley Park on the seawall. And by the way, that's the only statue of a Canadian in that park. I know there's the Pauline Johnson Monument, but that's not quite a statue. Everybody else there is a Brit, mostly, I think. And it took a delegation, Harry's name is also on the volleyball and velodrome in Port Moody. It took a delegation of black people, 3 pleading appearances at North Vancouver City Council to get a commitment from that community to place Harry's name on something, anything. And as for other members of the Jerome family, except for Barton, we all eventually settled in Vancouver. I attended UBC and began teaching the year I married, 1964. I married fellow optimist strider and high jumper Ron Parker. After having a hamstring tear in 1961, I gave up track and field, except to run in the Vancouver and District High School meet in '62. However, after our marriage, I did lace up my spikes again at the urging of my husband, and I did compete for Canada at the 1966 Commonwealth Games in Jamaica, and was extraordinarily happy to be there when Harry, after all those horrific injuries, had been able to claim a gold medal in international competition. But the issues of race still brought moments of excruciating anguish for me and members of my family. My husband's mother had carried out a great campaign to prevent my marriage to her son. She called friends of mine and former foster families in her efforts to have someone persuade us not to marry. Ironically, her big argument was, "Think of the children they might have," which are the words she cried into the phone in so many of those calls. Yet when our son was born, no one could have been a more loving grandmother. 6 weeks after our wedding, Ron and I drove to Banff for our honeymoon, where we had reservations at the Banff Springs Hotel, a Canadian National Railway-owned hotel at the time. At the check-in desk, the clerk stared at the two of us, then went to check with the management. It appeared that the hotel was overbooked at that time, and they could get us a room at a small motel across the river, one that we had passed on our way into Banff. I was embarrassed for my husband. What had I inflicted upon him? His mother was right. He should not have married me. I was mostly ashamed and a little more than hurt. We never discussed what had just happened, but settled into that noisy yellow motel and made plans for how we would spend the week. Another deeply humiliating instance of being turned away from an establishment was just a few years ago when a fellow teacher and I went for a bite to eat after a Tuesday evening symphony concert at the Orpheum. At the door to Francesco Alonghi's restaurant, he, the owner, looked me up and down, and with utter disdain and disgust in his voice said, "We don't let women like you into this establishment." Women like me? Not just black, but probably a hooker. In seeking a teaching position after my final practicum, I was offered interviews in both districts to which I'd applied. The first of these was with North Vancouver School Board. I arrived for my interview well-dressed and with outstanding marks for my practice teaching in Burnaby and North Kamloops. Mr. Frompson did not even offer me a seat. Within the first 10 seconds of that meeting, while still holding the door, he told me that North Vancouver did not offer positions to people who had graduated from that school district. And I knew instantly that to be an outright falsehood because one of my good friends had just been hired the previous day. And I was signaled to leave right then. So the following week, I was very grateful to Mr. Irwin of Vancouver School Board, who did offer me a chair at that interview and ultimately told me that he looked forward to my having a classroom position in the coming fall. Heartbreakingly sad, though, for me, was that first year of teaching. It was nightmarish. I had absolutely loved teaching my grade 5 class, but I dreaded going back to school every Monday morning. I trembled every time I laid eyes on the principal. Mr. Harper referred to some of the children in my class as "that little darky over there," meaning either Barbara Risby, Surinder Bring, or Raj Gruel. He used the N-word frequently and offered to give the strap to some darky before we set off on a field trip, a lesson to what might happen if the child misbehaved while we were out of the building. I followed the advice of my librarian friend, Anne McLeod, who insisted that the Vancouver School Board would stick by this elderly principal whom they were paying big bucks rather than take up the cause of a young teacher on probation. I finished the year but resigned in June. I headed back to UBC for another year. And again, decades later, after that first encounter with a racist principal, I met my last one. And we were in the dying days of the 20th century. Mr. John White was our principal at Sir Wilfrid Laurier School. And I reported at a staff meeting that a newly arrived student from Haiti was being called nigger. He bellowed in response to the whole staff that if Vanessa was being called nigger, she probably deserved it. She must have kicked someone in the nuts. That is a verbatim quote from Mr. John White about a little timid girl who hadn't been near enough to any student to do any kicking. And UBC was not a piece of cake either. The year that I had gone back to escape the dreaded Jack Harper, my professor of creative writing was always encouraging of the white Rhodesian students' student with an apostrophe S, use of the word nigger. I did complain to a member of the faculty about this, and my marks on our weekly submissions fell from very high to bare passes. But that word was used ubiquitously in our culture with eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I'm sure none of you have ever heard it. And other racist expressions like the nigger in the woodpile. It would even appear on the pages of the Vancouver Sun on occasion. And twice I went down to the Pacific Press building to speak to Stuart Keat, the publisher, about the cruelty that this word inflicted. I suggested that Vancouver's largest daily should perhaps offer a higher standard. The first of those conversations concerned a column written by their food writer, Eve Johnson, as she described a Louisiana dish as nigger food. The second concerned an article that included all the lyrics to a song sung by Ian Smith's troops who were fighting in Rhodesia for the continued white rule. The reader was informed that the melody to these verses was that of the well-known Seasons in the Sun by Terry Jacks. And I asked Mr. Keat, was it really crucial to the understanding of the news article that the chorus of that song was printed 4 times on the page? We have joy, we have fun, shooting niggers in the sun. And Stuart Keat said, yes. In the late 1980s, when my son Stuart Parker took over the leadership of the Green Party of BC and led the fight to ban CFCs, and was number 14 of the 867 people sentenced at the Clackwatt protests, he pulled me into green activism. I ran in 7 elections for the party, in civic, provincial, and federal runs, and traveled to Switzerland and Sweden to attend green conferences. However, the only time my race became an issue was in the 1989 provincial by-election in Point Grey. Gordon Wilson, who was at the time running as a Liberal candidate, brought along a troop of supporters to every all-candidate meeting. And at every meeting, that same aggressive woman would attack me, either coming in or going out from that meeting. You should not be here. We don't want niggers. I did speak to Gordon after the second or third upsetting confrontation, but she continued to attend and inflict her ugly words upon me and my son. My father's early retirement from the CN Rail was because of a stroke. He had been studying hard for the exams that he would be writing to qualify as a conductor on the CNR. It did not matter that for the previous 15 years he had been covering the role of both conductor and porter on his train, which branched off from the Transcontinental at Kamloops and went down the Okanagan Valley to Kelowna. He had wanted to ace that exam since it had taken 5 years for this opportunity to become possible since the adoption of the Bill of Rights. But he had the stroke and his life had changed. He struggled to find new accommodation that he could afford. My husband Ron had to make this happen after I, to no avail, had gone with my dad over a 3 to 4 week period to perhaps 15 different apartment blocks in the South Granville area. We were turned away from every single one with the words, "Oh, we just rented it." Yet the for rent signs remained openly displayed. Finally, Ron was successful in renting a suite on the northwest corner of 12th and Granville, and we moved him in. He eventually did qualify for senior subsidized housing in the West End. He was also very disappointed, but very realistic, that things had not changed that much since the Bill of Rights had been put into law. During the early part of his retirement, he had gone with his friend Bob Jackson to carry out small-scale sit-ins at eateries in downtown Vancouver, where they would never be served. They would leave after half an hour and then seek a Vancouver police officer to take back to the restaurant with the hopes of having a charge laid. Not once did they ever even come close to success in changing that unwritten Jim Crow law. Seeing the renowned entertainer Leon Bibb, who had recently taken up residency in Vancouver, being arrested at Kitts Beach for allegedly being a pimp, was hurtful to all of us. Not embarrassed enough by this incident, the local police followed that up with the arrest of another. They put Provincial Court Justice Valman Romilly into the back of a police car and took him downtown as they had Mr. Bibb. Both these black men had worn hats, and that's all it took to be assumed guilty. Racism is a constant, erosive evil. You might think the old saying, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me," is true. But I assure you, you could not be more wrong. Going back to the racist policies and behaviors from my grandfather's time to the racism that my family endured and up to the present, it hurt and deeply damaged members of our family. Individually and as a family, we were fractured and scarred. It seems to be taking a long time for our country to live up to that well-intentioned Bill of Rights. And it is taking so much longer for the attitudes of citizens to understand that people of color can be Canadian citizens. Neil Basundat wrote in his 1994 book, Selling Illusions, that people of color are forever referred to as Black Canadians, Indo-Canadians, Chinese Canadians, that our citizenship is only partial, never fully Canadian. He longed for his kids to grow up as Canadian, not Trinidadian Canadian or Black Canadian. He despaired of the multicultural paradigm promoted at that time. He wanted full citizenship, not hyphenated citizenship. Just as I do when I ask you to not ask me, where are you from? And a reflection on our past athletic endeavors, it was wonderful to qualify for a Canadian team. We wore uniforms that told us clearly we were Canadians. And when and if you were lucky enough to ascend the podium, the results on the scoreboard said Canada. It didn't say for Harry, African Canadian. It didn't say for Lori Fung, Chinese Canadian. I long for that kind of affirmation outside the sports arena. In closing, I would like to acknowledge that many, many loving and wonderful people did recognize me as an equal, who did afford me the dignity we all deserve, and who were extremely generous in helping me along my path. So despite the discrimination that continues to this very day, I need to be hopeful. There he is. So this is my symbol of hope. I need to be hopeful. Here in my last photo is 4-year-old Gabriel Mamo. He was born here in Vancouver on December 15th, 2015. I hope he will not be plagued throughout his life with, where are you from? He's Canadian. Thank you.